Past the hills and rivers wide, where wildflowers freely bloom. In this land with skies so open, where can our children play? In cities bustling bright and loud, cars and lights that never sleep, do they find a piece of sky? Where can our children play? Bring them fields of green and gold, let their laughter echo clear. In a world so tightly wound, where can our children play? Mountains whisper ancient tales, forests sing in harmony. Will these wonders slip away? Where can our children play? Beyond the screens and towers tall, where dreams once were born and bred, do they carve new paths of joy? Where can our children play? Let's be stewards of this earth, guard the spaces wide and free. Do they find a piece of sky? Where can our children play? Fields of green and gold, let their laughter echo clear. In a world so tightly wound, where can our children play? Bring them fields of green and gold, let their laughter echo clear. In a world so tightly wound, where can our children play?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laurie Gagan. I'm part of the Wellness Crusaders. Welcome back to our show. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and often overlooked area of health: the connection between inflammation, blood clotting, and immune response, what we know as inflammothrombotic immunological response. We're also exploring how detoxification at the cellular level, particularly through an advanced form of zeolite, can support cardiovascular health in our increasingly toxic world. Joining me today, Dr. Richard M. Fleming, a distinguished nuclear cardiologist, a nuclear physicist, an MD, a PhD, and an attorney, with decades of research in inflammation and cardiovascular disease. So, whether you're a healthcare practitioner, a biohacker, or someone just trying to stay ahead of the health curve, this episode will offer clinical insights with real world takeaways. So, let's go ahead and jump in. Good evening, Dr. Fleming. I am honored to have you on the podcast today. But before we get started, what I would like to do is just have you spend a few minutes letting our audience know a little bit about you and some of the things that you're actually known for. Dr. Fleming, tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Laurie, thank you. I'm delighted. If anything I've done has been a contribution for you and the people in the field. I'm a physicist, nuclear cardiologist, attorney. I have done roughly 51 years of research in physics and then moved towards medicine, where I did the internal medicine, then cardiology, nuclear cardiology, antimatter, PET imaging, and then roughly 11 years ago, got my JD degree, my jurisprudence doctorate. In that amount of time, I've published extensively looking at what we were initially doing with American Heart, with lipids, trying to answer questions about why we were seeing heart disease, strokes, as people refer to it, which also plays into why we see high blood pressure, cancer, diabetes, obesity, miscarriages. It turns out that all of these are related. These chronic diseases that Bobby Kennedy is bringing people to their attention are really the result of our body responding to an imbalance occurring either due to too much of something or too little of something. And as you said, the name for the theory has changed over the years. I keep changing it. It's my theory, so I get to change it. My expectations of the medical and scientific community is different from the general public, but my expectations of the general public increases because I think that while the use of the terms that I sometimes apply sound like they are meant to be overly complicated, I also believe, having a father and a mother who had an 8th grade and a 12th grade education and were two of the smartest people I ever met in my life, that the general public should not allow itself to be talked down to by us oversimplifying. I think that if we take the time to explain what the terms are and you hear it, you'll begin to process it. And I think that people are a lot more capable than they're given credit for. And that's one of the reasons why I pushed this forward with using the terms. But I also remember that as I was taught as a medical student, that if we couldn't explain to our classmates who were younger what something meant when we used the medical terms, it meant we didn't understand the terms we were using. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very critical when people use abbreviations or acronyms and don't explain themselves, because more often than not, they really don't have that down. And the process of learning is a never-ending one. At 69, I have no plans of slowing down. I don't think Dr. Nicholas has plans of slowing down. We're not going to really have the impact in the world that we want to have by slowing down and just expecting somebody else to come along. So the inflammo-thrombotic immunologic response is our body's response to something. And when it's out of balance, it becomes a disease. So it's an inflammo-thrombotic immunologic response disease. And COVID is a classic example of that, but so is heart disease, CVAs, cerebrovascular accidents or strokes, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, cancer, miscarriages, the arthritides. These are all the end result of the body not being in balance, not being homeostatic, as we refer to it. And typically, when physicians or scientists get into trouble, it's when we try to perturb the system and push it one way, and the body responds to try to bring homeostasis back, and it overcompensates doing the other. So that, I would say, that's the theory. Obviously, a lot of work with that's gone into all these different diseases. The patent FMTBDM, which is the only available method, it's the only patented method, so therefore it's going to be the only patented method for some time until that patent expires, that can quantify or measure these metabolic and regional blood flow differences in the body. And those differences in metabolism and blood flow define our health and our state of disease. So I would argue that anything that we do to correct that balance, including, Dr. Nicholas' perspective of zeolite and his other products, if those products address those metabolic and blood flow issues, we should expect to be able to measure that with FMTBDM and demonstrate improvement. And that's really what we're going for, I think, in this era of MAHA. It's not just a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's actually making a difference in all these health problems that have occurred, finding these problems sooner, addressing them less toxically, less damaging to the body, and getting not only America, but humanity back to a better state of health.
Wow. That's a lot to digest. So, Dr. Fleming, let's kick things off. Can you offer our listeners a fresh perspective, even though you just talked about the inflammothrombotic immunological response, but offer our listeners a fresh perspective on how it specifically affects the heart and the circulatory system?
Right. Well, any of these different factors that play a role, whether it's cholesterol, fats, excess calories, homocysteine, infectious diseases, and I would argue that on the infectious diseases, you should not have to be a physicist or a rocket scientist, kind of the dumb physicist, to figure out that if you have a virus and you have a genetic vaccine and the vaccine encodes for the toxic or harmful part of the virus, then you're also potentially talking about genetic vaccines. That may or may not play a role to various extents. Interventions that occur, a lot of the different things that we talk about, diet and lifestyle, smoking, alcohol, all play a different role. When people look at this and they're looking for simple answers, a good way to think about this is to think of it like a spider's web. You can have all these different factors or variables as strings or part of the web, all right? And what may distort the web in one person may not distort the web in another person. There's multiple variables and multiple factors. Put in terms that my parents might have used, the straw that breaks the camel's back. What is it for any given individual? And it's typically not the same thing. One person can be exposed to the same trauma to the body that somebody else might be, but it only affects one person. Why? Because the health and the state of the individual is different. Other cofactors are different. And so what we do know is that there's a whole host of these variables that play a role together, some of which we can measure in blood tests. But the problem with measuring blood tests, just like the problem with just taking your weight, is that is a far downstream effect. And what we're not waiting for is damage to be so big or so much of a problem that we're measuring it by weight or blood tests. It's really the tissue level where it's going to happen. And we know, for example, with myocardial infarctions, what people call heart attacks, where there's a final blood clot that forms in the artery of the heart, a coronary artery, that about 80 to 85% of all heart attacks occur in an artery that has a 30 or less percent diameter narrowing, because the inflammo-thrombotic immunologic response is in the wall of the artery, preventing the wall from being able to relax to increase its blood flow and that flow reserve of the heart. So you may not know you have a problem until, as I've said a couple of decades ago, half of the people find out they have heart disease by dropping dead of heart attack. That's their first warning sign. And we need to get to a place, if we're serious for America and the world, that we ask ourselves very pointed questions. What are the problems that we are introducing to our bodies? People can, I've heard some, what I'm just going to refer to as mocking, red dye number, whatever. Okay, red dye number whatever is a component. It's a thing to recognize. Glyphosate being sprayed on our foods is a thing to recognize. I was in the grocery store, a couple of days ago looking for tomatoes, and I didn't buy them because they had a 4 number at the very beginning, which means they've been sprayed with pesticides and herbicides, right? And 8 means it's GMO, and if it has a 9 at the beginning, it means it's actual real food that hasn't been altered in some way. Well, with a 4, I'm not going to cut that up and ingest that, because you can't scrub a tomato hard enough to get the toxins out of it. and that means it's going to go in you. And there's an old expression, eat to live, don't live to eat. And we need to remember that whatever we put in our bodies, food, liquid, air, medications, you name it, it's going into our bodies, and there's a consequence to that. And I've told people for decades, you don't treat something you put in your body by putting something else in your body. You treat it by not putting the first thing in your body. So we need to be very cognizant of. I really enjoyed your introduction, because that's the first time I've seen that, where it really addresses the health of the food and the lifestyles that we are living in.
Thank you for that. And so, if I understand you correctly, Dr. Fleming, someone going in to have a CAT scan isn't going to show anything with heart disease.
So you may or may not see calcium. Here's the example for people to do. We have two basic types of tests. We have tests that look for anatomy or structure. This is like taking your teenager to the car lot for a car, and they look at the cars and they go, wow, that's a really great looking car. I like the structure of it, okay? But you have no idea how well that car runs. You want to do a test drive. You want to see how it works, how it performs. That's called physiology. And so we have the fields of anatomy and physiology. Most of the tests that we have are basic structures. Is there something big enough to be structurally seen? But that in and of itself is typically not the problem. You know, most cancers, for example, have been around for a while before they're big enough to be seen on a structure. And when you're looking at a structure, just a lung cancer, if you have a lung cancer on a chest x-ray or a CT, and it's 1 centimeter across, or 2.54 inches is 1 centimeter across, and you wait and you take another x-ray, say 6 months later, and it's now 1.25 centimeters across, that may not seem like much of a difference to you, but it means the size of the cancer has doubled. The volume has doubled. We don't want to wait till something is big enough to be seen. We want to find things when they're early, when we can do less toxic things to them. And we want to see the structure. And so even though you see this big mass, for example, for a cancer, on the very inside of that cancer, where the blood flow is really being deprived and the cells are dying, so calcium leaks out, which is why we see the calcium. You're not seeing that. You're just seeing this mass. What FMTVDM, or Fleming method for tissue and vascular differentiation metabolism, sometimes just shortened to Fleming method, does is it uses the functionality of the human body to give away these changes in blood flow and metabolism and then measure it. So it will see things that you can't see yet on a CT scan or an MRI or an X-ray or anything else. We want to know what the function of something is, and that's what tells you what you're really looking at. For example, if you have somebody driving a car and they're driving it intelligently and they suddenly speed up, what's the function? Why did they speed up? Well, it's a good thing, even though it might put people at risk, if the reason they sped up is because there's a woman in the back seat who's going into labor. That's a good thing. But all you see is a speeding up car. Now, let's imagine that somebody just got into the car and is carjacking it, and now they're speeding up. Is that the same thing as the pregnant woman delivering in the back seat of the car? It's not. All you see anatomically is a car speeding up. FMTVDM tells you, did it speed up because there's a pregnant lady in the car or a carjacking going on?
Thank you for that explanation. I've heard you explain that at several of the conferences that I've been with you. So, Dr. Fleming, genetics. So, genetics is always a hot topic, especially with lipoprotein little a, which so many doctors don't even look at. Are there specific genetic predispositions that make someone more vulnerable to an exaggerated inflammothrombotic immunological response? And how might someone find out if they are at higher risk?
So there are a lot of variables that play in genetically for a number of diseases, including lipoprotein little a. Whether you have to have those genetics or not, we don't know exactly what percentage of people are going to be impacted by that, because again, as I would, with that example I gave earlier, it's one of the webs in the spider web to determine whether it's really having an effect. But lipoprotein little a certainly was underplayed for many decades. It was part of what I introduced in 1994 with the original theory, with an understanding that it's basically related to low density lipoproteins, and those tend to have better data on genetics. Although every time I hear a genetics question, I always have a little pause in it, because there's this expectation that people are going to say, see, it's not what I'm doing, it's my bad genes, and I'm going to blame my parents for it. When we get to something that is so critical that it determines whether the species will survive, and diet and nutrition and the lipids and all of these factors that play a role, well, most of them, because some of them are caused by human intervention. So clearly that's not something that we would expect to be played out genetically. All of these variables are going to have more than one genetic foci addressing the problem. And the best way to explain that is, when we launch a spaceship, when we launch any rocket, we don't do it with just one system. We tend to have the system running it and two backups. Why? Because we expect a failure. And if there's a failure, the only way that you keep a rocket from blowing up, for example, just using that simple approach, is to have backup systems. You know, when the space shuttle first was trying to be launched, we watched the rocket power up and power down and power up and power down, and the general public had no idea what was going on. And what had happened was the mainframe computers at Capcom in Houston filled up that entire room below the visual where you see the spacecraft trajectory. And those were IBM computers that were purchased in the 1960s when nobody thought computers would advance. But by the time the space shuttle was launched, they had laptops that could be inserted into the shuttle, and they would run the shuttle. And what we saw was the shuttle was saying launch, and the mainframe was saying shut down. And they argued back and forth, so you'd see it powering up and powering down. Actually, what NASA did, that launched the first space shuttle, was they disconnected the onboard laptops that were trying to protect the shuttle and launched it. And fortunately, it didn't blow up. That story serves to say you need backup systems for something critical for survival. When we eat, what we eat, and how it plays a role in this inflammo-thrombotic immunologic response has multiple backup systems. So failure in one genetic sequence is not going to kill the individual. Most of the time when babies die in utero, it's because of a genetic defect that was so defective that there was no backup system to protect, and the baby died. To keep humanity alive, we have to have so many backup systems that are critical for these homeostatic processes this inflammo-thrombotic immunological response, and what we eat, that if there's a failure in one, going back to your question, the lipoprotein little a, it's not detrimental to you because you have other systems that will work and keep you out of trouble until you insult the system so much by overwhelming it, as Dr. Nicholas mentioned, because you now overwhelm the homeostatic process that's supposed to protect you. And that's typically what we do. We overwhelm. This species is so good at taking a system that has kept us alive for whatever number of years you want to have, okay? My number is probably longer than your number, but and staying away from theologic conversations, it's designed to keep us alive so that when you have a genetic fault, you really can't blame your parents, because the reality is most of us have the bad genes that people want to talk about. And 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, those bad genes kept us alive. And today, with our processing of foods, our caloric condensation of foods, the inactive lifestyles we have, those now catch up to us. We're no longer running from the beasts on the Serengeti. We're now living in a different type of culture where these potential genes can be detrimental to us if we're not watching. And for example, when you take the Japanese population and you go back 3 to 4 generations, you will see that the height of Japanese citizens on the islands of Japan is much shorter than their grandchildren and great-grandchildren today brought into the Western culture. In fact, we track that very closely when they were Japan to the Hawaiian Islands and then to mainland. And there wasn't a genetic shift that occurred in 1 to 2 generations. That takes thousands of years to occur. In 2 generations, the typical Japanese descendant grew in height, grew in weight, and amazingly enough, grew in heart disease and diabetes and cancer, all related to the only change that we can track is the diet and lifestyle that occurred in the children and grandchildren as they left an Asian Oriental culture to a more Western civilized, deadly civilized culture that we now live in. So where lipoprotein little a genetics plays a role, I'm not going to give anybody an out by saying, oh, it's because of the bad genes you got, because we're all basically living with that same cluster of genes that was designed under austere circumstances to keep us alive. Now we have to deal with the genes that have kept our species alive, and we either have to demonstrate that we are intelligent enough to deserve to continue to live as a species by recognizing the problems and regulating it. This sounds very much like a parent talking to their child, right? But this is really where we are. Humanity now is kind of the child that wants to do whatever it wants to do. And, science hopefully is the parent trying to say, and I know science has taken a beating over the past few years, and I have maintained, I think Dr. Nicholas has maintained the quality of science as science is supposed to be. We didn't all cease to exist. The fact that other people are using the term science and not applying the same ethics and boundaries and consideration doesn't mean science has run amok. It means people in the field have run amok, but that is true of everything, whether it's science or farming or politics or law or any of the other fields that we get into. But now science, as the adult, needs to look at the children and say, these are the things, if you want to live a long, healthy lifestyle, it's possible, even with all the garbage we have in our food and our water and our air. It doesn't mean that we should just say, well, to heck with it, let's just keep polluting our water and air and food. No, it means we need to take responsibility for that too. But in reality, this is 2025, and in 2026, planet Earth is not going to become this clean, pristine place that it was 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. We will have to live with the ramifications of the damage that we've done. There is a consequence to us not caring, not being the stewards of this planet that we have the responsibility to be. We're going to have to step up and take accountability for that, or we will suffer the consequences. And we have seen the consequences in the last few years of humanity electing not to take responsibility. 10letters.org, not to beat that into the ground, is the recognition of the responsibility of taking responsibility for what we've done on this planet that we shouldn't have done. When we make biological weapons, there's a consequence. When we imitate that and put those gene sequences into something else and inject into people, there's a consequence. We have to live with this consequence, or we'll die with the consequence. We can either all hang separately or hang together, but I prefer the hanging together in the sense of sticking together, as opposed to what Hitler did at the end of World War II, when he said, well, if the soldiers are running, hang them, and that'll stop people from running. So it's time we quit hanging ourselves as a society, and it's time we look at the problems and become serious about it. And nobody said this is going to be easy. Nobody said we're going to wave a magic wand and in 1 or 2 years, our skies are going to be clean, our water is going to be purified, but we don't have to keep polluting it. We can work on cleaning it up, and we can work on what we put in our bodies. And, I don't want to be in the position of micromanaging people and what they eat and drink any more than I want to micromanage the people that work under me. I want to think that if I have my meetings, or in this case, if we tell society what they should and shouldn't be doing, that I don't then need to micromanage people. But we're now to a stage when we start to have these discussions that we can no longer accept the excuses of, well, it's just my genes and it's not my fault and all the food is garbage and, well, I like to drink. It's the only way I deal with stress, or I'm going to smoke my cigarettes because it's the only way I deal with stress. Well, there's more than one way to deal with stress. And some of that stress, as Dr. Nicholas pointed out, was oxidative reduction, right? That's real chemical stress, which has to do with which way the electrons are flowing in a pathway. But how we respond to that, how we mentally respond to that, how we physically respond to that, and how we respond to each other is going to play a major role in the type of health and well-being of humanity. And I would really like to encourage everybody to work on this together, because the sooner everybody else works on it with us, the longer life I expect to have. And I don't think at 69, I should be looking at 10 years or 3 years. I should be able to look at doubling my lifespan from where I'm at right now. Because I think, again, I don't know what Dr. Nicholas does for athletics or the rest of it, but I go running every day. I do some weightlifting every day. I like to play baseball every day with my youngest son. There is no reason why we shouldn't all be doing this. There is every expectation that I have that, today in 2025, we should be able to have these conversations. I would say that the rationale of FMTBDM is to figure out where your health is or where your disease is, and then allow you to work on it with something less toxic. And I'm a firm believer that anything that we put into our body that is for a treatment other than food and water should be something that we look at to bridge the gap between the problem we have and improving our quality of life so that we don't need to keep adding those things in. You know, you don't put in your mouth something else to treat what you first put in your mouth. You don't put the first garbage in your mouth. And to the extent that we can control that, and we can make improvements on it. We should do that. And so hopefully that answered that question, Laurie. I know
That did. Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Fleming, last question. What inspired you to write your book, Stop Inflammation Now?
Well, before I answer that, I'm going to address Dr. Nicholas a little bit and give an example for people to understand. When Sir Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, it was the result of Petri plates in Scotland being left out and not being cleaned, and his observation that the fungi inhibited the bacterial growth. In the early stages and use of that, a lot of people made penicillium, or penicillin as a lot of people refer to it, with a lot of contaminants, a lot of protein contaminants. And so a lot of people who received penicillin were told that they were allergic to penicillin, when in fact they weren't. They were allergic to the protein contaminants that were already in the compounds that were being done. Over the course of time, some people decided to purify and to come up with a much better product. And that is one of the reasons why very few people have allergies to penicillin. The ones that tend to that are older, it's because their bodies saw the antigens, the items that the proteins that produced allergies, with the penicillin and the other proteins originally, and then even with the purified penicillin, their bodies still said, well, that was connected with this other protein that I was allergic to, so they have allergies. But today, few people are allergic to penicillin because it's purified. It's been cleaned up. And I want to use that as an example because Dr. Nicholas had pointed out their efforts to purify their product and the importance of that. And if you don't think the purification of a product is important, I want to just ask you to keep your ears open because there's a research paper out of Slovakia and the Czech Republic that they and I have done on the genetic vaccines of Pfizer and Moderna, where we're going to talk about the difference between purified compounds and non-purified compounds. And you're going to see just how potentially lethal it is to have the non-purified compounds. So this goes to Dr. Nicholas's efforts to make sure that what he's doing, he gets down to the fundamental process of his product so he knows what he's working with and there's not a question about something else. Now, your question to me was, why did I decide to write a book on the Stop Inflammation Now book?
It's my favorite book.
I'll throw the other 27 out there. The answer was very simple. You know, I joined American Heart in 1976 as the youngest faculty member. And my efforts at that time initially had to do with lipids and rewriting the lipid numbers. Dr. John Farquhar, who was one of the 12 of us who's passed away, a good friend and colleague, he was the man who talked about metabolic syndrome first, not the people today that are trying to take credit for it. And one of my thresholds for giving people credibility or not credibility is whether they quote or note sources, the original people who did something. And Farquhar, you know, he was the one who put that together. I mean, there were 11 of us on the committee with him. He put those numbers together and made so the people that want to take credit for his work today, they get no ethics problem as far as I'm concerned in science and medicine. And if you demonstrate that you're unethical, that's probably you. But it was very clear by the time I was working through the 70s and 80s that I was not getting to the bottom of the answer of what was causing heart disease. I mean, it was very clear. And when I originally did the theory and laid it out in 1994, and it got published, presented in American Heart in 94, again in 95, then published in a textbook in 99, and we did the 2020 episode in 2004. One of the things that I laid out in the textbook chapter and the Stop Inflammation Now were hundreds of research papers that other people did. I didn't do them. They did the work. They did the work on homocysteine. They did the work on lipoprotein low 80. They did the work on fibrinogen. They did, it was taking the collective and bringing it together to develop that image back there on the wall to put the pieces together. So by 1994, it was clear to me I had to present at American Heart, where I was faculty, and this was not warmly received at the time, the nuances of not just looking at lipids, but at looking at other variables. And that meant that I started by just looking at cardiology literature in the US, then internal medicine literature in the US, then nutrition literature in the US. And then I expanded out. I said, well, maybe we don't have it all. And looked at Europe and Asia. And by the time I did all that, it was very clear that there were pieces that nobody had put together, and there's, as I've said multiple times, I've only shared about 2/3 of what I know with people. Interleukin-6 was one of the pieces that I had not shared until recently, and I know not Dr. Nicholas had mentioned that. But we had that data back in the early to mid 90s. Again, trying to put the pieces together. I don't come forward. I'm not going to redo that thing again. So by 94, I was trying to explain to medical colleagues, and 95 and all those. By 2004, I had people that had asked me to please try to put something together, not only for the medical community, but for the general public. Trust me when I say the last thing I wanted to do was to, because I write research papers, and none of my papers that I've ever submitted have I ever thought this is good to go. Every one of them has been, I could work on this for another decade and I would still not be happy with it, but it's movement forward, and 500 papers later, I still feel that way with everything I write, which is I will never write anything that I'm completely happy with, but I'm going to write it to the extent that I think it's ready to at least start people talking, right? So the purpose of writing that book is the same purpose as of anything, which is to look at my audience. And, I've told you this numerous times. When somebody says, hi, I am so-and-so, and it's usually I'm Dr. So-and-so, my first response is, okay, a doctor of what? Because if you're a doctor of education, I'm not going to talk to you like a physicist or anybody else. My focus is to know my audience, who I'm speaking to, what examples I can use, how I'm going to get the idea across, if I can get the idea across. And that I typically think of that last one as my problem, not my audience's problem, because if I can't get it across to you, I need to sit down and figure out what it is that hits your gray matter, your brain, that I can reach, that I can use as an example. So when people came to me and said, would I write a book for the general public, I sat down and I wrote that, and it's probably the most interesting. I'd already written a couple books, How to Bypass Your Bypass, The Diet Myth, and then this one. And this one was different because this one, I had an agent that went to the publishers, and I got this very excited phone call from him one day. And he says, yeah, I mean, I've sent it off to a couple publishers, and they're really excited about this. And I'd only sent the proposal, with a brief outline. And he said, but don't get excited, because they say this for a lot of things. And the next day he calls me up and he says, I got to call back. She read it and she couldn't put it down all night, and was like, my brain said, well, great. I don't know what you want me to do with that. But we set up a meeting to go to meet several publishers. And the Wednesday before that meeting, I got a call from somebody who was involved in helping to write it. And he said, could we cancel the meeting? His son had just been in a motorcycle accident. I said, oh, Tom, listen, seriously. How's your son? Number one, how's your son? The very important thing. Well, he was in critical condition. He was in the intensive care unit. It's like, Tom, don't worry about it. I'll cancel the meetings. Don't worry. And Thursday, I called him up. I said, how's your son? He says, still in intensive care. I said, okay. So we had a little conversation. Called him on Friday, or he called me on Friday, and he said, let's go ahead and do that meeting. Let's do the meeting. We can do it next week. The doctors tell me they're going to transfer my son out of the intensive care unit tomorrow, Saturday. I said, well, Tom, here's the deal. People get transferred out of intensive care units on the weekend, Friday, Saturday, for two reasons. Either they're doing better or they need beds, and they're hedging the bet that you'll do okay. I said, don't worry about it. I've already canceled the meeting. Don't worry. We'll reschedule if it's supposed to happen. So Monday comes and he says, we can do it. He's supposed to home Wednesday. And I said, Tom, that's great. Get your son home. When he's home, doing better, then we'll talk. The next morning, Tuesday morning, I walked in, and my chief nuclear technologist says, Dr. Fleming, you got to see this. So I walked in. He says he was showing the Today Show. And he said, do you know where you're supposed to be today for that meeting? And I said, yeah, right there. That was 9/11, and our meeting was in South Tower. So that book, we were supposed to meet in South Tower for that meeting. And that's one of I probably should have been there. I've always felt I should be there because as a physician, had I been there, I hopefully could have helped some people. But that book was not only written for the general public, but that book represents something of a reminder of 9/11 to me. That's very close. The President of the United States was brought to where I was at later that day. So it's close for that reason. And then when 2020 actually aired the segment, they came in advance and recorded it. And Barbara Walters had left 2020, and she wanted to come back and be a part of that program. So Barbara Walters' return on 2020 was the day that program on that book, on Stop Inflammation Now, was aired, because Barbara Walters wanted to be there at the time to be part of that. So that is probably a little bit more encompassing story than you were going for. But it has meaning to me because of all the people that were involved and the experience that we were going through. And for a brief moment, when Americans could pull themselves out of self-centeredness and look at other people around them. And for a brief moment, while the rest of the world saw the United States as standing together, much as Dr. Nicholas made a comment that the health of our neighbors is important to us, what happens with the rest of Americans is important to us. This is not a matter of them versus us. This is a matter of all of us, humanity, Americans, other countries, looking at everybody around us and saying, if I'm true to this idea of trying to make this a better world, I am only going to do this if in fact I truly want to make the world better, which means I have to step outside of myself long enough to make a difference. And so the accolades I think that Dr. Nicholas has had, and those that I have received, at least speaking for myself, and I'm pretty certain for him right now, these aren't for me. These aren't accolades about me. These are accolades about doing something for humanity to make this a better world, to make our quality of life better, and the lives of our children and our grandchildren. And in doing that, what is it? The scene out of Gladiator, what we do today will echo in eternity. What we do, how we respond to all this, how we treat other people, why we're doing what we're doing speaks volumes about who we are. And I think if humanity takes the position of doing for humanity to make all of us better and healthier, the message that will echo through eternity will be that. And if we do the opposite, it'll be that other devastating, non-desirable. And I would like to think that the reason for being here, for doing this, is a better humanity for all of us.
I love that. I love that. So thank you, Dr. Fleming, for this fascinating conversation. You've helped bridge the gap between clinical insight and practical everyday health strategies. I pray that God watches over you and your family. And I'm very honored to have had this podcast today with you. So thank you and good night.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Bring them fields of green and gold, let their laughter echo clear. In a world so tightly wound, where can our children play? Bring them fields of green and gold, let their laughter echo clear. In a world so tightly wound, where can our children play?